Hello everyone, welcome to the third part of this series. In this episode we are going to set up the design of our inventory. Just like before, we'll rely heavily on Breath of the Wild's UI design in order to set this up. The goal of this video is to set up the look and feel, less so the functionality. We'll make sure all of the basics are there though. Before we start, I would like to thank all of my Patreon supporters for the amazing support. This scene will be made available on Patreon as it gets updated. In our last video, we set up a basic HUD for the player, and we'll be continuing in that trend by setting up the next user interface, which will be our menu. Now, the first thing we are going to do is we are going to duplicate the current HUD and we are going to rename it to menu. In this episode, we'll only really set up the inventory part of it, but we're going to call it menu because everything else will be a part of it. Now I'm going to delete toolbar minimap from the menu, so make sure you don't delete it from HUD, because the health bar still needs to be visible in our inventory as well. Now that we've set that up, I want to immediately allow us to actually use this as well, so I'm going to use a trigger here. This will be on key down, and we're going to use escape. So our escape will open up the menu. Now let's set up some conditions for that as well, and we're going to rename this to menu open conditions. It's a bit of a long name, but at least it's really clear what it does and keeps things organized. I'm going to add a clause and 2 sets of actions. Now the clause is going to rely on if the menu is active, yes or no. And if you are on Game Creator 1.19, you'll have a little toggle box here. Just leave it as default. And I'm going to add the actions for else first. So if our menu is not active, we are going to change our time scale. And the time scale allows us to change the time in the game. So 1 is default, 0 is time is frozen, which we'll need for our menu. And then we are going to use a simple set of active. So we're going to activate our menu. And we are going to turn off our HUD. So really simple. I'm going to copy over those actions, all of them. And we're going to turn those around. So if menu is already active when we press escape, we want time to go back to normal, which is 1. We want our menu to be turned off and our HUD to be turned on again. So a really simple set of actions allowing us to use the same key to open and close the menu, simply relying on if the menu is on or off. Now I'm going to switch to 2D view here. There we go. And let's turn off that HUD because we no longer need the HUD. We have our health bar here, and we're going to create an image which will be our basic design. This is something that will carry over for the other menu tabs as well, which is why I'm going to keep it a tiny bit separate. And obviously I experimented a bit with this, and this is about the right size. I'm going to make that black, and we're going to keep it to 70, so have a light transparency there. I'm going to duplicate this one again, and I'm going to drag it down to about here. It's about right. Duplicate it again, and this will be our little line, and this needs to be white. And maybe this is not that little, so let's make it a tiny bit smaller. It's just a really small effect. Let's actually call this line. And let's call this bottom bar line down, and duplicate it, and we'll rename it to line up. These are just some graphical elements just to make sure we are as close as possible to the actual design. And let's position it correctly to about here. Perfect. And we need one last one, which is the general one, and let's just call that background. And that's the one we're going to use in the middle part. There we go. Perfectly aligned. And this will have a transparency of 60, just to be a bit lighter. Maybe 60 is even too dark, but we can change that afterwards. So this is the basic design, really simple. And I'm going to drag all of these into the design folder, because this is something we'll be using for the other tabs as well. Now, in order to differentiate our tabs, I'm going to add our UI, use text, and let's call this inventory tab. There we go. And the tab itself will already be the text, and let's make that a bit better. So I'm going to, what am I going to size this? I think 49 was what I used last time. And let's just make sure overflow is on. So I'll align in the middle. Let's make the text white, and let's call this inventory. There we go. And align it to about here. In our inventory tab, we're going to have a couple of items as well. So I'm going to add a image. Going to make this a tiny bit smaller as it's a bit too big. Going to align it about here. Let's add a piece of text to that as well. And this is the adventure log. Needs to be a bit bigger. And let's make it white as well. To drag that under. Now for this image, I'm going to use one of the assets that was in the fantasy bundle. So I'm going to go to fantasy UI and then go to simple vector icons, and I'm going to look for L1, and I'm going to drag that in. Now obviously this is with the intent of actually using, there we go, it's better. So let's just do 60 and 60. This is in, with the actual real design in mind, so that's why we have those buttons. If you're not going to use a controller at all, just change it to a different type of image that fits better with the game you're going for. Now, I'm going to rename this to L1. And just simply duplicate this, rename it to R1, because that will be on the other side, and drag it over here, and this seems about right. And change this text to system, and we just need to find that R1 button and drag that in there. There we go. So the first parts of the inventory are about right. Seems pretty good. Now, in order for the background to actually be blurred out, there's a couple of ways you can do this. Now, unfortunately, there's not one way that will work exactly the same as I'm showing for all different render pipelines. I'm going to rely on post-processing here to do this, which uses a bit of power. So if you are using URP or HDRP, I would recommend creating a shader, but you can also just follow what I do here, and it will be slightly different as post-processing will be in a different place. Keep that in mind, but it's actually slightly easier with HDRP and the likes. So for the default though, let's just go to our main camera and we're going to add a post-processing layer, and this layer needs a layer. So I just created a simple one and just called it post-processing. So that's the one I'll be using. And let's turn it on. Now that's it for the main camera. We can go back to our menu, and in our menu I'm going to add a post-processing volume. I'm going to make it global, as this is global, and it needs a new profile, so let's create one. And we're going to add an effect, and this effect will be depth of field. Now, how much you are going to do completely depends on you. I'm just going to do one, something like this. And we just need to make sure that this menu is actually tagged to post-process as well. No, this object only, and there we go. Now, before we actually start adding the inventory module specific things, we're actually going to give this a try, see if it all works. So let's turn off our menu, turn on our HUD, and let's give this a go. There we are, our character. And if I press escape, we have our menu and the background is blurred. Now you will see that the hearts are dark, and we're going to fix that as well. It's just a simple order. But as you can see, all of this looks fine. Maybe a bit too dark, not really sure. You can lighten that, just change the color or transparency. But the blurring all looks good, and that's all nice. We're going to press escape again, and we're back. Now the reason the blurring automatically gets turned on and off is because we simply put it on our menu layer. So if the menu is turned off, the post-processing is turned off as well. So a really easy way to make sure it works correctly. So yeah, pretty cool. Now we're going to go back to actually editing our menu, because now we're ready for the next step. But one quick thing to make sure the health bar is correctly visible is just drag it down. So the way all of these items are ordered is actually the order in which they will appear in your UI. So keep that in mind. So something like this will need to be on top if there's nothing that is going to overlay it. So yeah, quick little thing. Now, all of that works fine, so we're going to go over to actually adding our inventory here. And I'm just going to look for inventory. And there we go. As you can see, it adds it. Going to drag that in our tab here, the inventory tab. Now, you can do all of this manually. I just want to be absolutely clear about that. You do not need to do what I did and use the prefab. You can manually go over all of that. I just don't really see the point in doing that, to be quite honest. I don't see why I would manually add all of these layers, so I'm not going to do that. And there we go. So inventory content. There's something to be said for doing it manually, but personally, if you can speed things up, why wouldn't you? So our floating item, I'm just going to render it transparent because I don't really need to see that. And we're going to continue with this. So here we have our inventory. The content inherits the canvas from the original, so we're all good there. So we'll be the correct size, and we're going to move this along. Now we have equipment here. I'm just going to turn that off for now, as this is not something we're actually using, and we're going to just be using our inventory. Now just one little thing, I'm going to turn off the animator, as that's not something we need to use, and these have a couple of scripts which we'll need, so we're going to keep that as well. Now the background is something we don't need, so I'll just delete that. And our inventory is something we're going to, well, just drag around a bit. So I'm just going to resize this so it all fits correctly. There we go. And this is going to be about the right size. I'm just going to make sure I'm not making it too big, because we still need to display our character as well. Yeah, this seems about right. Now, this contains a couple of things. So we have our container items, as you can see right here. And we have our header, which has all of these things. Now in our header, I'm temporarily going to disable weight, as this is not something that is present in its current form. I'm going to drag our currency here, and I'm going to remove that background. Let's make sure that text is white as well. There we go. And it could be a bit bigger, maybe. I don't know, 34, 40 maybe. There we go. You can change the image of the currency to whatever you want. I'm fine with this. I think in the example I used one that was also in the fantasy bundle. There's just so many icons you can use, so you know, be creative, pick something that looks good. I'm fine with this diamond for now. So in our header, let's actually make sure our panel is set to none, because we don't need to see that. Let's remove that as well. I'm going to remove the close altogether. Don't need the close button. And we have our menu. Now this menu is actually quite good. Every tab just filters whatever is present in the inventory. So let's change the order, and the moment you change the order here, it changes the order in the UI, which is pretty nice. And I'm going to duplicate this 2 times. Let's just drag these up. And now I need one more, which will be at the end. So we're going to use this as our tabs. Now these tabs are basically just filters, and they don't need a background. So let's select all of these, remove the background, and change the color to transparent. I don't want to mess too much with the functionality, as the functionality is actually great. So I'm going to definitely keep that in, because why would we complicate things? And there we go, we have our menu. Let's drag that bit here, it's about right. And let's replace these images. Now for the first ones, I'm going to use the images I created in the last tutorial. So I think we have our weapon here. I'm going to drag that in. This one needs to be the shield. And for the other images, I'll actually be using some of the ones that are in that fantasy bundle. So fantasy UI, the same place where I got that L1 and R1. I think it's called t-shirt. Yeah, there we go. I think this one was called eat, which is definitely, let's make sure we look in here, there we go. And for the last one, it was called book. Perfect. So there we have our images. Now these images also need to filter on something. So if we go to Window right now, Game Creator, and go to Preferences, we have these types. So these are all tied to the inventory. So inventory types. And right now we have potions, equipment, right hand, helmets, left hand, and recipes. So those match what we need to do here. If you don't have any of these, just add them. So sorry if I went too fast, but just add them here. So if you don't have recipes, just add recipes here. These are just filter options for our items. So we're going to go on each tab and go to change item list, and we're going to change the filters. So this needs to be right hand, not everything. This one needs to be left hand. So let's just do nothing, just remove it all and go to equipment left hand. Let's do the same here. I'm going to do nothing, and then helmets. Now helmets is a bit of a weird name, but basically that's just for the armor. Potions was already correct, that's why we're going to add our food as well. And we have the last one, which has to be recipes, so nothing again, and then recipes, and it's all there. So we don't have any items yet in our game, but we have all of these categories already set up. So when we're going to create some items, we'll just make sure they all align with our tabs. So pretty cool. Just going to change this to, no, that's the wrong one. Need to actually change the scroll bar, the handler, there we go. And I'm just going to change this to none. We'll have a closer look at what we can do with this a bit later on, but at least we have some basic functionality, and all of this actually works. Now the next step is actually adding a image that displays our character. And I'm going to add that to our inventory content, and this will be a raw image. About this size. Now I need to make sure it's properly square. So height 780, width 760. So let's see if we can make 770 work on both sides. There we go. And I'll explain why it needs to be square as well. Now our next step is actually adding a render texture. So let's add one. Let's remove our search field here, and let's create a render texture. And there we go. And let's call this character inventory. It's not an original name, but here the same. We need to make sure this is actually in a proper resolution, because by default it will be really low res. And that's it. You can add anti-aliasing as well. Let's do 4 samples, 2 samples, I don't know. Let's just add something. And in our raw image, we're going to drag in the character inventory. So our render texture. Now, right now, this is not displaying anything, obviously. So let's make sure it does. So let's turn off our menu just for a bit, and go to our player, switch off 2D view, and let's find our player here. There he is. And we need to add a camera. But as you can see, it is really dark and his face wouldn't be visible. Well, most of the front wouldn't even be visible. So in order to make sure everything is properly visible, I'm going to add some lighting, and this is nothing advanced. We'll be going over how to properly set up lighting in general, but let's make sure we can actually see our player. So added the lighting tab, and I'm not changing anything for the moment. I'm just going to click on generate lighting, and our player is visible. Now the floor is really bright and quite a bit annoying. So let's create a really simple material. Let's call it terrain. Drag that in our scene. And in our inspector, let's turn down smoothness and let's just change it to, I don't know, it's a bit of a weird color, but just imagine at one point this will actually be a lovely terrain. So the reason I did this is, as you can see, we can actually see our player now, and that is going to be quite important because the way our character will be displayed in our menu is through a camera, and if the camera sees a shadow, it will record a shadow. So let's make sure that is done correctly. So in our player, let's add a camera. And I have a couple of settings here for this camera because I played around with it quite a bit, so I know what works for me. You can obviously change all of this to whatever you want. So I'm going to reposition it. And I would advise just following along with this, and then you can alter it to whatever you want. That's about right. So as you can see, we see our player properly. He's in a pretty good perspective. Let's do it like this. There we go. So in our preview, and I'm pretty sure if we keep that on, this is what he will look like in our inventory. So pretty good angle, looks pretty nice. Now the next step here is actually dragging that render texture we created in the target texture. And this will clip the view quite a bit, which is nice because we don't need to see everything else. But we still see the background, we still see the sky, and we don't want to see any of that. So what we're going to do is we're going to make sure that our character, so not the player, the actual character model, has a layer. And I already have one, and the way you do this is you click on add layer, just like we did for post-processing. You add a layer you want, just pick out a right name, and then on the layer, on the component, you select the layer you set up. Change children, sure. And then on our camera, we are going to change the culling mask, so we're going to press nothing. So right now we can't see anything, and then we're going to click on character. And right now we can only see our character. We still see the background, so let's make sure that's gone as well. So we select solid color and make sure this is set to transparent. Now you will still see it blue here, but that's okay. And there we have it. Now if I open up my menu again, so let's switch to that 2D view. There we go, a bit of a scroll. We have our character. I don't know why this is completely out of place. Yeah, this doesn't look right. Let's actually press play and just see what happens there. Yeah, everything is completely the wrong scale, so that's pretty interesting. But at least he looks good. He looks really sharp, high res. That's nice, but this is not what we want to happen. Now that is definitely one of the downsides of just copying over a prefab, of course. But as you can see, even though this was all supposed to scale accordingly, the resolution might be right, but the scale is wrong. So it's scaled to 1.7, and that's just something the prefab has. So not 0, but we just need to change this to scale 1, and everything will scale along just fine. So yeah, you know, a small fix that will help everything along. Now if we go and press play again, and let's just make sure all of this is set up correctly. We have our character and we open up our menu and everything looks just as it should. So we have our character and we have our tabs. Now the tabs won't do anything yet because we don't actually have anything yet, and we're definitely going to fine-tune a bit of what all of this will look like, so there will be more indications of how to use stuff, but I thought it just made more sense to already set up a basic so we can actually get started with the game and just have something here. Now I want to add a couple of little details, not really all that important, but just to fine-tune the look just a tiny bit. So when we go to our menu and we have all of this information, just going to add one more thing, which isn't just dragging that here. I'm going to rename that to dots. And yeah, this is a really small detail, but this will actually be dots. So you need a circle sprite, sorry, and I have one from the UI tools, which is the mini map mask, but basically it's just any sprite that is a circle. If you don't have one, just drag one in from Photoshop or something like that. It's just a basic small circle. And it needs to be about here. And let's duplicate that. That's about right. Let's make it a tiny bit smaller. Let's say 16 by 16. It needs to be a bit more transparent, so about this. I'm going to duplicate that one. And let's just drag it here, which seems to be pretty much the opposite. And there we go. So little detail, not all that important, but yeah, considering this is mostly about the design anyway, it's something that just seemed necessary. Perfect. So now that all of that is done, we actually have our fully functioning inventory, and it functions as a pause menu at the same time, but there's nothing else in there than just the inventory look. But that's all we're going to do for now, and we will add correct functionality to all of this, but at least all of our tabs are actually fully functional. We just don't have any inventory items to display yet. So our next step will be to make sure we can actually use the inventory module with our weapons as well, so that this little piece is actually something that is relevant and dynamic and not just a static image as it is right now. So hope you enjoyed this part. If you did, please hit like and subscribe, and I will see you next time.